Well, good evening, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us here tonight, and appreciate you spending some time here on a Thursday evening with us here, learning more about a topic that I know we have been getting an awful lot of questions about in Farm Bureau world, and certainly it's a hot topic of conversation, not only just across the country, but really locally throughout the state in Nebraska, as counties are having these conversations and local communities are having conversations focused in on data centers and what they mean for their communities. And we certainly want to try to be as responsive to that as we can. I probably should introduce myself to start. My name is Jordan Dux. I'm the Senior Director of National Affairs on staff with the Nebraska Farm Bureau. And just as a reminder for everyone, this webinar here tonight will be recorded. That recording will be sent out to our farmer and rancher members so they have a chance to look at it. But really, given the conversations that are happening around the data center front, we took a look at our policy at Nebraska Farm Bureau and had the pretty quick realization that we really don't have any. And so, as this conversation has really kind of picked up steam, we, want to make sure that we are responding to where our members want us to be. And unfortunately, today, that is, we don't really have much to say on this conversation. And so, what we try to do as an organization is try to provide you an opportunity, really, to hear from experts and try to learn more about some of these topics, especially ones that we don't have any policy on. And tonight, we are very happy to welcome Scott Sandal here with us tonight to talk about his experience with data centers. And what we try to do is really try to provide as much of an unbiased take on the topic as we can, given that we don't have a position necessarily on the subject. And Scott had the opportunity to speak with the chief administrators and presidents for the Midwest region for Farm Bureau, and so had some very good feedback from that conversation. We thought, well, let's bring Scott on and chat with members here this evening. And so I'll introduce Scott here, and then we'll turn it right over to him. So Scott Sandal has spent more than 2 decades at the intersection of agriculture, technology, and data infrastructure. From his humble beginnings on his family ranch in western South Dakota, Scott got his start at database administration and network engineering for Wells Fargo and Gateway, and then moved into agriculture technology with Ag Link, building traceability software for the food chain and helping to implement RFID solutions for the National Animal ID system. Work inside the same producer facing system Nebraska agriculture actually relies on today. In the early 2000s, Sandal designed and built a small scale data center facility near Yankton, South Dakota, launching a career now spanning more than 15 years in data center infrastructure, capacity planning, and facility design. He co-founded Data Vatter, a data center site selection and facility design firm, and then moved into vendor side roles with a couple of companies with Rotarian. I can't know. I want to make sure I get that one right. And since 2015, Sunbird Software, where he now serves as vice president of data center information management client services. Sandal has spent much of the last 15 years both advocating for data center investment in the upper Midwest and pushing communities to evaluate those things with clear eyes, including publicly cautioning against speculative projects that outpace what local power and water infrastructure can actually support. Scott serves on the Lennox School Board as their president, and with his wife Heidi leads the Lennox Digital Age Club, a student-run initiative producing a community data center feasibility study. He has presented on data center utilization to audiences ranging from the Sioux Falls Rotary Club to the Yankton Community or County Commission, and has been a featured speaker at AFCOM's Data Center World Conference and Schneider Electric's Data Center University. Scott and his wife Heidi live in Lennox, South Dakota, in the area there, and we're just excited to have him on this webinar for you all. And Scott, without further ado, I will turn it over to you.
You bet. Thank you very much, Jordan. And yeah, I'll go ahead and I'll leave my camera on so you can see me as I go through the slide and any interaction I have. And welcome everyone. Thank you. I'll go through a recap again of kind of who I am, because I think it's very important to understand where I come from and how I got into this industry. being the data center industry. So as Jordan mentioned, I have 30 years in IT career, spanning all the way back to Gateway, is where I started in document management systems, turning companies into a paperless environment. And then about 20 years ago, I got into the data center field. So that's my background. I currently serve as the vice president of Sunbird Software, where we are an infrastructure management software company. And what that means is our software is utilized by data center managers to optimize their environments, right? So a lot like your field management type software. We have data center managers who want to understand how much power they have coming in their building, how it's being utilized, and where they can find or use their resources better. So that's what our software does. Since coming over to this side and working with a software company, I have built a team of over 50 plus data center experts here in South Dakota. I really don't have a data center industry here in South Dakota to speak of. You guys have some bigger ones around the Omaha area, but South Dakota really doesn't have one. So it's been kind of interesting creating a team where an industry doesn't exist, but yet to help out that industry. So and as Jordan mentioned, I have served 9 years on the local school board in Lennox, so try to do my civic duty as well, giving back to our community. I am a Dakota State alumni from Madison. For those of you who know where Dakota State is in Madison, South Dakota, it's a computer school. So back in the day when I graduated, it was all about COBOL programming, going to work for Swan's Ice Cream or Citibank. I ventured off of that trail and went to Gateway, but that's where I came from. But I really like to tell people my background, and my siblings and I still own it. I'm a West River ranched, so Western South Dakota, raised, ranched, cow-calf operation. And I like to call out that I am a product of a two-room country school. And if you remember two-room country schools, their teachers are a little bit different in terms of how they treat us. I'm also, as you see in the picture here, I'm a father of four, 3 graduates from Lennox, 2 grandchildren, and all their plus ones as we grow our family. So, but really what I want you to know is, as I'm here to share knowledge, today, as I stand, having built a data center in Yankton, it was only a 1 megawatt facility. I'm here to share with you my knowledge and experiences that I've gained with working with data center companies or more data center managers in 50 states and 110 countries. I've been in all but 1 state so far working with customers in many, many countries around the world, some of the most interesting places where facilities have been built. So that's just a little bit about me and my background. So you know where some of these slides will go through as I talk about data centers and how I relate them back to my agriculture background, because that's what I know second best to data centers. All right, so to get into this, I've been asked, as I've done many talks, to not assume or presume, right, that everybody knows everything about a data center. I've had people come up to me during presentations after the presentation is over and say, "Hey, Scott, that's really cool and all, but I don't even know what a rack is. And I don't even know what you're talking about putting inside of them." So I'll start with a set of slides here that we go through that reference where data centers really came from, how they evolved, and what we're seeing now in the data center industry that's creating the most hype, which is the AI type facilities. So as I mentioned, I was a Gateway person, so I always love to start with the Gateway computer up in the upper left-hand corner. I did start the career in Sioux City at the North Sioux City facility, again, doing document management. So I always tell people that's really where I got my basic beginnings in the computer industry. Post-college or post-education, was working at Gateway, doing document management. And as you can see, over time, this has been the evolution of just our PCs, right? Of course, I don't show a laptop or other things in here, but yeah, back to the day where you had those basic PCs, and I'm sure some people can go way back to early days of PCs. And I had ours in the early 90s or 80s when we got our first one. Moving over to where your modern desktop is, moving down second of the screen there is your gaming consoles, which a lot of kids have, Xbox, PS stations, whatever they are. And then as you move from that computer up to the more powerful computers, the gaming PCs, or I was just at a friend's house who have a golf simulator, who that simulator is running off of one of these more intense GPU type PCs, you're seeing inside of there that liquid cooling that goes to the GPU or the graphic processor or the, again, GPU inside that in order to cool that device. Now, it's important as you look at this is because this is the basic trend of what we're seeing today in the large data centers or AI data centers that are driving off of the same kind of principle or difference of principle, where the PC in the upper two windows would be air cooled, where just the room temperature can keep them cool. But when you get to a gaming PC, you need that little bit of extra in order to cool, because those things run, 3x hotter than what your basic PC does. So that's just a base reference around what is the starting place of where computers started and where we are today, just in your home gaming systems. And as a reference over on the right, I'm just really talking about how personal computers move toward this digital age, which has led us into early days of what I'll show you later as traditional data centers, and into the hyperscale facilities, again, catching most of the buzz and hype. So you just take that basic computer, flatten it down, and you put it into a cabinet, and just basically a shelf. So this has U positions. U's are just shelves in there. Put those computers in a rack, and that becomes the beginning of a data center. So you can see on the screen here on the left-hand side, that's just a computer being taken apart and put into a rack. Up here in the upper center of the screen, that again is not just a basic computer like I showed you on the gateway one. This is a liquid cooled, and so this is a rack of liquid cooled to chip type of GPU computers or GPU processors, right? So that's, you take a server, crunch it down, and you put it in a rack, and then you put a whole bunch of them in a rack, and that's the beginning of a data center. Then you take that rack, put it next to another rack, and you start a row. And as you start that row, so this is these are NVIDIA devices, right? But you got 2 or 4 of those in this rack. You put that rack next to another rack, and you fill them all up, and that makes your row. And then the row together, so this is 2 rows facing each other, which becomes a pod. So that pod is facing each other, and under the floor, so that's where traditional air, back to the basic PC, this room would have been flooded with air handlers around the room that pushed air under the floor, and as that pressurization let the air come up underneath of that rack, then the computers could breathe, basically pull in that cool air, and then it would just blow out the back, let the room flood. So that's what would be called a pod. So we got a rack, a row, 2 rows facing each other becomes a pod, and that pod with these doors at the end, that becomes a cold aisle containment. So different designs are designed. One could be a hot aisle where they slide the racks back to back, and they contain the hot aisle and only push that out, leaving the room to be flooded with cool air. Or they'll do like this and push in the cold aisle, containing the cold aisle within this quote unquote pod room. But those are not enough for today's GPUs. So that's where you look at bringing liquid to chip, because the airflow that would be pushed under the floor is not adequate to cool the GPUs inside of here. If it's a traditional data center, that air would be plenty. And I'll get into that later, where the cabinet design, the capacity, and I'll talk a lot about capacity, the capacity of this rack in traditional data centers could have been 5 to 25 kW, in the air could handle that. And in the mod or AI type facilities, again, the GPUs run much hotter. So you get that requirement of having to cool at the chip to get the heat out of there, so the servers don't overheat, or like that gaming PC, those don't overheat. So you take that pod, right? So you can see it starts to begin here. So we have our rack, our row, our pod, and then the enclosure, whether it's cold aisle or hot aisle. Take that, and then we put them into a bigger room, and you start to get the full effect of the large inside of a data center type environments, where this is just pod after pod after pod after pod of those type of computers with in-row containment or a row containment. And each one of those pods has its own capacity as well. Right? Take that room, put that room in either a modular. These are modular type data centers. They're going to be anywhere from like a few hundred kilowatts of power all the way up to a few megawatts of power. Then you get into your individual buildings, and some of these buildings can get up, 10 megawatts, 25 megawatts, 100 megawatts. This particular one might be 100 megawatt. Then you'll have multiple buildings on a single campus. And that single campus then, as I said, will have multiple data center buildings. But like in this data center, there could be 2 or 4 data halls. And a data hall, as a reference, is a room like this, but cut out with its supporting infrastructure around it. Right? So this is, again, just a look at the pod. So the row, the pod, the power, the bus bar that connects to the power to feed those. Within that, in this room here would be considered the data hall. Okay? And so that data hall has perimeter air conditioners. And again, as I mentioned, if these are running hotter type of GPUs, they're probably going to have liquid to chip, but the building itself will likely have 1, 2, 4 data halls or more. 4 is typically the size that I see. Now, to support that data hall, right? So just think of your laptop or your phone or whatever. You have one power cord, and that one power cord you plug into an outlet. That outlet goes back to the breaker box. That breaker box goes out to your street power, and the street power is delivered to your house. So think of it in that equation. But in a data center, well, we're supplies that feed to 2 different, are fed by 2 different UPSs or battery banks. And in those battery banks, that then is likely fed or supported by another separate generators. And then those generators are fed by utility. Now that could be a single utility or multiple utilities. Okay. Second to that is you also have redundant air conditioning or redundant cooling within the same space. So there's going to be multiple of these air handlers around the room where they're running either like an N+1 or a 2N, meaning the redundancy of them, that one could go offline and the other one would handle the room or the row. And you also have, if it's liquid to chip, redundant cooling there. And that's where we start to run into, okay, the bigger the room, so the data center that I built had a 1 megawatt generator attached to it, an air conditioner, air handlers outside. Each one of these are air handlers, so it goes outside. Nobody really notices that facility because it's 1 megawatt. There's not a lot of cooling required because it was a 5 megawatt facility. So the more megawatts, if you will, pushed to the building, the more heat that gets generated. As that heat gets generated, it needs to dissipate out of the building. And that's where you start having, like in this picture here, where you start having multiple of these fan units that are air handlers. And there are many, many different kind of designs as how to get the air outside and out the door. Some of them are good, some of them are not so good. Some of them need re-engineered. But there's always new technologies coming. But that's one place where when you hear sound reference to the outside the building being constant and loud, that's typically coming from those fan units that are pushing or pulling the air, if you will, and dissipating it out into the environment, okay, off of those servers. Similar to that, going back to like the generator system, if there's a failure of the utility power, there's probably multiple generators next to there. Again, 1 megawatt facility, when that generator runs, nobody in the town even knows it runs. It's like most of the high schools or schools have generators to keep the food supply going and whatnot. Nobody really notices those generators, but you have multiple together simultaneously. So you get to that 25, 50, 100 megawatt, 200 megawatts, 1 gigawatt in size. Now you've got multiple of one thing being put together. So all in all done, that is where we're talking about just the basics of a data center, of the typical construction being the data hall with the IT rooms inside of it. Okay? And the IT rooms being the data halls, and then the infrastructure around it to support it. Right? And I've been in data centers of many types around the world. Again, I try to note everywhere where I got my sources. All this stuff that I'm showing you is non-proprietary. It's from somewhere I found online. I just know what I'm looking for. But I will share this slide with this deck with everyone so you can have it as a reference for the membership and my information. So I'll move on here. So then, well, what is the job? Why does data centers even exist? Like, what is the job of those? I'll share this out, but it's just basically to be a secure location that houses information. That's the basic premise of a data center. Is when we decide that I don't want to store it on my computer and I want to put it in the cloud or I want to take pictures, we started pushing all this data into data centers, which some of that became public data, like our Facebook accounts, Google searches, those kind of things all became public information, if you will, right or wrong. Don't want to go that point. But that's then where we started venturing into the AI training, because that public data, that data available to those models, is where we started training things like ChatGPT, Claude, Gemini, etc. So the basic beginning of data centers was just to store our stuff somewhere secure that wasn't on our local PC or local desktop, and then our pictures and photos. All right. So I did a project, and I know Jordan mentioned this in the beginning. Our city administrator came to me in the community of Lennox where I lived and asked me if I would help them understand data centers and possibly write an ordinance for the community, or maybe kind of understand what we could do. And having been 9 years on the board, I asked them, can I simply just turn that around and get a group of students to study what are data centers, which turned more into what is infrastructure, and what infrastructure do we have in the community that could even support a data center, and what is that benchmark to be able to say, hey, city administrator, what we found is that if any data center comes knocking on our door, this is the max capacity that our utility company says we can even start to have conversations. Not saying that's what we would go or they would do it, but this is where our starting points are in those conversations. For Lennox, that just happened to be 5 megawatts. That happens to be kind of the baseline starter. Is anything 5 megawatts or less would be a reasonable conversation. If somebody comes in wanting 25, well, now we know, hey, you're going to have to figure out how to get other infrastructure here. And so you're going to have to work with the utility. And then that helps us as a community understand what questions to ask the utility that we don't have to pay for as payers, right? So now we have our baseline starting for those conversations. But I asked ChatGPT, what and who uses a data center, and what are they at a high school level? That's the prompt on the right-hand side. And it created this graphic for me so I could kind of bring some humor to it. But for you guys, is this group, I went and found a couple other pictures online, which is, what are data centers in agriculture? Like, where do we use, or where do we find data centers in the agriculture environment? And I threw these slides together. I chuckle at this one on the left-hand side because it is AI generated, but you can see some words are not spelled correctly. And that's the world of AI that we know today is yep, some stuff is correct, some stuff is not correct. It's still learning. Is it, as some people say, at its worst today and it will continue to get better, or it will forever be like this? Those are some, again, a whole different topic, but things that I like to bring up. But around a data center, right? This is the areas that we see, and you can go to any one of our ag businesses and follow the trail as to where our stuff is stored in their facilities. And that's going to really get us into more of the traditional data centers, insurance, banking, agriculture, school systems, some big school systems, city or state government. They all have facilities. Our federal government has a lot of facilities. That would be your traditional type. So getting into types of data centers then, so if we in agriculture use them, what types do we have, or how do we break that down? And I break that down for me. Now you'll see all kinds of data points, because this last 24 months, I will say, has been a really wild ride for me. Given the fact that about 36 months ago, I could have had a conversation with 10 of my best buddies, explain to them data centers, explain to what I do and how I help data centers find optimization within their existing facility or footprints, only to meet with them another week later and them to say, what is it again you do, right? Like, nobody wanted to know, nobody cared. And then AI hyperscalers entered the scene. right? And so I'm going to define a hyperscaler, an AI hyperscaler, and there's two key points here. Is one is a, well, three key points is a 100 megawatt campus that's designed at 70 kW per rack or per cabinet or larger. And there's some key components in there because once you hit that level, you're now starting to use more power, more liquid for cooling, probably more noise. That's their hyperscalers, and that's probably getting most of the traction. Then you have Bitcoin mining and cryptocurrency. They are what they are. They like to bring in GPUs and just burn them as hard as they can to mine the coins that they want to put on the marketplace, right? So they are what they are. They're just a computer out there screaming along, trying to get data out. I don't support any of those or very few of those. I don't think we even have any in our portfolio because they don't care where the assets are or how much they use out of there. Then you have the traditional data centers, and that's where I've played most of my enterprise or career here so far. We are working with some hyperscalers as we start to see what their needs are. But the traditional data center build out, they're going to be anything from a KW to a megawatt in size. And they're going to be designed typically either that 5 to 50 kW per cabinet power consumption. It's still a lot of power, but that's typically where they're going to be designed. And airflow or rear doors, like a radiator slapped on the back of a cabinet, can handle that density of power put into that cabinet. That is the data center that I designed and built there, as the picture shows. But this is really where we're talking about enterprises. So your ConAgra, your John Deere, your even the animal ID traceability kind of systems would have went into that enterprise. Healthcare. I did a project with a health company where we went out and audited every one of their closets within every one of their medical clinics and hospitals so they could get an inventory of what's in the room and manage the environments of those rooms. And that project went from Nebraska through Arizona, New Reno, Colorado, where we did that audit project and put the data in the system so they can manage it. So again, this is where you can talk about university research, co-location, DR, disaster recovery type facilities, our compute and storage, our desire to store all of our pictures, everything we take. And then, as I mentioned, IDF, MDF closets and data spaces. So that's how I define or break down who am I working with, because it also shows me what their business model typically is, if they're running a data center for themselves or trying to run it for else. Co-location does get people a little confused once in a while. I'll break a co-location sort of like your local co-op and grain elevator where, hey, I've got some grain at home and I have enough bins for maybe most of my grain, but I need a backup location in case I need to take some off or I need to store it in another silo or sell it or whatever it might be. So co-location is kind of the same principle, which is really, hey, I have my on-premise or my local data centers that are housing my primary stuff, but I want a disaster or a backup location or a secondary location, but I don't want to build another data center. To do so, I'm just going to rent space in another location of another data center operator. And that's what the data center was that I built there in that picture. It was really designed to be a co-location space or for most customers out of Sioux Falls area because it's in proximity, an hour and a half to get to or less, and not in the same range. If Sioux Falls got hit by a tornado, Yankton likely isn't going to. So that's your kind of typical DR co-location. Again, these are your traditional data center spaces. But to really get into the heart and soul of the subject, where most people are talking about when you get to the hyperscaler or get to the environmentals of the data centers, there's valid concerns. There really is. I don't want to mitigate that from anybody around what is the air pollution. If you concentrate many things in one place, you're going to have an immense amount of whatever it is. So in this case, it could be air pollution, noise pollution, light pollution, increased cost of whatever electricity because you have a large user on there, wasted water. Like how do we take care of the runoff, climate change, what's happening in that ecosystem. So I try to break this down in the agriculture world to what I understand is, okay, well, what are we really talking about? What are the things that we should be concerned about in order to kind of do a comparison? And I personally take that to the two places where I have properties, I'm again South Dakota, so I have property out north of Wall, South Dakota, so out on the northern flats of the Cheyenne River. I have property out there, and then I had property in Yankton. And so there's two different carrying capacities that I know about that everybody understands in the ranching business, right? So, and I equate that very similar to a cabinet when I break it down. So to give you some statistics around the two ranches or locations that I have, is in Meade County, we have a carrying capacity of 20 to 30 acres or animal units pairs per acre. We have to go for water sources there. Our neighbor has a well that he went down, artesian well, 2,500 feet. It's pressured enough. It brings water up to about 250 feet below surface. We still have to pump it up. That well then serves about 7 ranches in that immediate area. And our annual rainfall in that country is about 16, 19 inches of rainfall. So our carrying capacity there, what we can actually handle, is much less than when I come to Yankton County, which is where I built the data center and had land for a while, where it has a 3 to 5 acre carrying capacity. The wells we hit there are about 200 feet, plus we have a lot more water reserves or dams, if you will. Dams on the ranch tend to go dry fairly quickly about this time of year. And also in Yankton, we run about 25 to 29 inches of annual rainfall. And that, if you can equate that to the data center, going back to the 5 megawatts, okay, this is the carrying capacity, if you will, of Lennox. The town of Lennox has plenty of fiber, has water sources of plenty for 5 megawatts. And so that's the carrying capacity of the community. And now we would still want to dive into it if somebody come knocking on the door at Lennox to say, hey, I want to build a data center. Okay, what's your design? Who's gonna run it? Who's gonna be, not necessarily who is your end customers, what is your type of business, what's the business model, just to be due diligent of our community, would ask those kind of questions before doing the moving forward with any kind of. I hope that after we did this study, that's what our city council would do, was ask them those kind of questions. So again, it's just to register in this kind of an audience. That's what I look at, or we should look at, from any data center. And what is our carrying capacity? Do we have one? It could be 0. It could be 100. Don't know, but that's where we start, just kind of a baseline conversation. Now, does that mean on my ranch I can run 30 pair, one pair per 20 acres? Well, I'm going to have to supplement things out there in that country. Like I say, the good old timers out there always told me as a kid, and my father as well when he was alive, we are 2 weeks from a drought every day in Western South Dakota. So prepare yourself for that kind of a lifestyle when running cattle in the country. So if you start to go that 20 or below and you're not supplementing pretty hardcore, you're going to run your grass ragged. So that's the same thing when I look at data centers. Do the same kind of analysis so that we don't run our community ragged. Okay. So going back to the data centers then, stepping back into those racks, as I mentioned earlier, racks are designed, early traditional racks. Most of the stuff you will have data centers throughout of, I know lots in Omaha, several in Lincoln. You go out west, like I say, I did an audit in Ogallala for a couple locations there for a customer. Those are going to be that 3 to 5 where the air handler or air conditioner within the room can handle it. Then you start going up the path. And yes, this is the video that I have from Mechanical Electrical Academy, LLC. You can go out and watch it. That really talks about, okay, as we climb to the denser per cabinet, again, think about that GPU or that gaming PC, we've shoved several of those into one tiny space, and that's where that heat becomes a problem. And so how do we get rid of that? And I just like this slide to share it. But on the back side of that, this is an actual set of 2 servers, some different cooling technology going back to the gaming PC versus the regular PC. So inside of a rack, this is what the back of a server, an NVIDIA server, looks like, an A100, where the air comes across the motherboard or across the GPUs, across the unit, and can cool and be pushed out the back with the fans. But in the case of the NVIDIA 180 gigabyte liquid cooled, it requires a loop to go in across the motherboard or across the GPU processors to get that air, that heat out of the system safely and at the time that's required. So when you take those 2 systems, you get into what kind of technology is utilized as we scale up in capacity of a rack. So this is a 3 kW. Again, that's just perimeter air conditioner, raised floors I showed you in the first one. But as we start going across to the liquid cooling, the high density type systems, the upper boundaries, that's where we start getting into that liquid, using more water, more fans, more pressure to get the heat off of the system so they can operate effectively. Now, I personally, just a personal opinion here is yes, these are the current technologies that are being utilized in the data center space to effectively remove heat out of the space, away from the computers. These are current, but I really hope and think we're starting to see where industry, data center industry, and others, again, based to some of the pushback or community saying, not in my yard or not in my county or whatever it might be, the pushback of the data center industry is starting to push even more of what other technologies. So the industry in meetings that I've been in have really started talking about how do we find engineering or research programs that design water out of the data center, meaning the data center should be able to function and operate without having any kind of water utilization whatsoever. So how do we get back to that? Because there was a time and place in these early 3K, 5K where water wasn't even a usage within the facility. So if we're going to go there, how do we re-engineer that in time, and what universities can help us do that, and what money needs to be put into those programs to make that happen? So I just bring this up to kind of show you this is where we're at today in technologies, but rapidly evolving. And there's probably many people in this call that have found other things to go along with that. But that's where we are as an industry overall today. Typical designs in the cooling systems. All right. And to give you another viewpoint, this would be like what's known as the closed loop system. Now, this closed loop system is a closed loop system where the end of the row, the CDU, that's a cooling distribution unit. So the liquid goes out, it processes through these manifolds, just like the GPU gaming PC, where the hot air, cold air goes in, crosses across the processors, the heat transfers onto that liquid, comes back out through the hot lines, and it just repeats. It goes round and around in a circle. Now, in these environments where the liquid or the water comes into play, is typically this water, or not this water, this is typically a glycol kind of a mix. So like your car radiator, think of it more like that, like your car radiator. That heat then gets transferred off to a building loop. That building loop then has to go outside and be dissipated into the environment. And that's where you start hearing about like heat islands, and where, you know, you have those fans that are pulling the heat out of the building, and the larger the building, the more heat that's getting dissipated. And that's where you start to hear about a heat island around a data center, because the air is just being warmed up just surely due to the volume. Again, depending on the size of the data center. If you drive by the data center built in Yankton, you wouldn't even notice it's there because there's no measurable quantity of heat coming off. But to get to measurements, right? So to understand all the different utilizations, the left-hand side here, and this starts to get into what I really help customers with when I'm working with them, but is what is measurable? Like, what data points do you have? Do you have temperature front, temperature back? Do you know how much every one of your devices is pulling? Do you have power usage for the room, power usage for the rack, power usage for the row? Do you know how much power it's designed to pull, and how close to that design are you running those systems? And that goes from a individual device to a cabinet, to a row, to the whole pod, to the whole room. What are all those metrics, and how you're operating the space comparative to how it was designed? And in that you find the efficiencies or inefficiencies of how it was designed and how it's operating. And that's where we really get into the few of the last slides here, which is your data center system metrics, the sustainability metrics. How much power? So if I have a 10 megawatt data center, of that 10 megawatt, how much is lost just in the transfers? And a lot of data centers are starting to look at like DC power and not converting it from AC to DC in order to get a savings. But really, you're looking at how much power was provisioned to that data center and gets put into compute, subsequently pushing out compute, which is knowing power usage effectiveness. How efficient am I using power? Golden state, if you will, is 1.0, meaning every watt that comes in goes out in compute, nearly unobtainable. but that's what we strive for, is that holy 1.0 kind of level. Water usage, carbon usage, energy usage, renewable factor. I have some customers who are tracking all the data points overseas that can literally tell you that these 5 servers or these 10 racks or whatever it might be are running from these power sources because the utility has given them what you know as an API or a connection into their system, so they know between 7 o'clock and 10 o'clock at night, they're running off of renewable sources, right? So they're getting that tracking of, hey, which systems are running actually off renewable or not. Again, getting measurement points from a customer's environment. So I just leave this slide here just as a frame of reference for everyone. Gartner has posted this as a well-known, respected research facility in many industries, but specifically the data center industry as a whole, or computer industry. And this is what they've come up with as an industry as the sustainable measurement points. And to me, when I'm talking to communities that are looking to kind of write policy, that's where I say saying, okay, well, we need to understand, how do you measure the basic foundation of transparency? So if I go to a data center and say, hey, I want to know this, or if you're going to come to my community and build here, these are the things that you should expose to us as a community so that we know you're operating efficiently. And there's many more that we can add to this, but this is a baseline, I can say, foundation to that transparency. Okay. And then the next slide, our next point here. So as we build all that together, we have, okay, here's a computer in a rack, in a row, in a room. Here's the design around it. Here's the different types of data centers, some of the different technologies that are used inside the data center, different ways to think about it. We now get into, well, where are we at with just the basic demand? So this last slide here is a representation of the data center demand, both AI and non-AI. And this really depicts, and this is changing all the time, year by year, but what is tried and true here is that there is a 14 to 16, maybe a little higher, but 16%, 16 to 18%, sorry, 16 to 18% traditional non-AI demand and growth. That's you and I doing the things that we do on our phones, on our computers, in our cars, on our farms, on our ranches, tracking data, storing data. I'll watch them. I mentioned RFID in the past, animal traceability. I just saw an ad on TV here locally where there's I forget the name, but it's the collars that you can do wireless fencing from your phone, because it's a solar-based collar, shock collar essentially for your cows. And personally, I felt my father roll over in his grave, and I thought I would even think about bringing something like that onto the ranch, to having a wireless transfer up to the cloud to be able to track the cattle and where they are. But that's the kind of thing that's driving that non-AI consumption. Okay, and then you have on top of that the AI, and what AI means to us is a whole long topic on itself. Are we provisioned too fast, meaning have we built too many data centers for the AI demand as it's known? Is the AI demand real? There's a lot of good stuff out there on both sides of that kind of conversation, wherever you land on it. If you want to really know the strong side of, yep, we're over provisioned and there's a bubble coming, Ed Zitron, Zitron, does a lot of good talks around what he's discovering on the bubble, not from a construction, just from, hey, are the companies profitable and growing, over to where if you follow the CoreWeave side and their profitability, or where they're at today and their environment and their build out. And so those are two very far spectrums, wherever you land in the middle. But that's the AI growth that we're starting to see, true or untrue, right? Take your pick on any of that. So with that, Jordan, that brings me to the conclusion of all the material that I presented or had ready to present tonight. Happy to take any questions if you want to field any or bring any forward. Otherwise, I'm happy to come back and meet with your group anytime, or individual people. But hopefully that gives you just kind of a baseline of what are these things, why do they exist, where are we going with them, where can we start some conversations, and go from there.
Perfect. We appreciate it, Scott, immensely. I know one of the things that we get asked a lot, and we in Nebraska, a little bit uniquely, we're a public power state. And so We've made some changes to state law that would allow um, data centers to put some power on the grid. I know I want to just just for context to folks, I know that I've had some questions from members about, when you throw the power consumption numbers out there, um, put that in like a real world scenario in terms of what some of the the megawatt usage of some of these larger scale ones and even the medium sized ones. Compare that to say, like a city or a town, some of those kinds of things, because that's the question I get an awful lot.
Sure, and I can give you one to like Linux. Linux substation. Our substation is about a 20, called a 24 megawatt supply substation to the community of Linux. And the current draw off of that by the community, or about 2,500 people, current draw off of that would be about 10 megawatts ish, right? So therefore, utilities say, okay, I got about 11 or a little more of 11, because you're always trying to stay below that 80%. That's natural electrical code, to stay below the 80% of your threshold of your breakers, right? So stay below that. So that that equates to saying, okay, well, we could do 11 spare, but reality is you want to keep overhead for growth and everything else. And so at the 5 megawatt facility, that's well over a third of the half of the community, really. If we go back to,
Hmm.
so 2,500, that five megawatts is going to be equal consumption to about 1,500 homes of community.
Okay.
So that's just a baseline, and it scales up from there. Now you get economies and whatever, but just as a frame of reference, uh, the community uses 10 megawatts. If I say 5 or 2,500, using 1,000 to 500 megawatts per 5 megawatt facility.
Sure, sure. The other, you got into the water conversation a little bit, but obviously that's a big piece for us too, in
Yeah.
our state. Just given the amount of groundwater we do have, that makes Nebraska relatively attractive to some of these companies, which is why you've seen the growth that we've seen as well. Um, I know there's the talk an awful lot. I know Kansas talks an awful lot about the closed loop systems. Those are the ones they're talking about. Go into a little bit more of the water conversation, if you will, just a little bit for us.
Yeah. I have customers from all over the place. I have a customer in Lausanne, Switzerland, who their entire environment, both their campus and their data center, are all cooled off the lake that they sit next to. We've said they have that luxury because the lake is so deep. So they
Sure.
pull water off there, they run it through their system, clean it up, get it back to a cool state, and put it back in the lake. They've been doing this for decades. Um, so you have that kind of ecosystem friendly environment. But the real problem here, if you will, is the path of least resistance over the last few years in data center development is that water is the easiest transferable source of heat onto water out the door, right? So water is the path of least resistance, and having ran largely as an unregulated industry, if you will, just, hey, we'll build new, build new, build new, and we're kind of just building them as needed as we go. That's been the technology utilized. And so you do have, because of the growth and the size of those buildings, I definitely have customers who are using anywhere from a few tens of thousands of gallons to hundreds of thousands of gallons to a million gallons a day. And again, it's just over time, those designs and the scalability of the environment, where water being the path of least resistance to mitigate heat from environment out the door, was utilized. And so the industry, again, and I always equate to this, Jordan, kind of back to, there was an era in agriculture where we built on the hilltops of our feedlots because that was the path of least resistance to get rid of things. And at some point in time, the industry cleaned itself up, right? And so I equate that very similar to the water usage, is the data centers need to clean themselves up today. And by asking those questions and the community pushback and asking for transparency and building policy to say, hey, if you're going to use water, we're going to know how much and what
Hmm.
for, right? I also kind of, a story within Sioux Falls here, one time a data center back in 2000, early 2000s, when I built my data center, they had designed the building to have no water at all, not a drop of water built to the building because the air cooling was enough. And the community said, no, code does not allow you to do that. you have to bring water to the data center.
Hmm.
Right? That was, and I chuckle about this because this is how the industry has changed because of the density and the heat. Now another data center came to town, speculators, if you will, but came to town, and the size that they're needing, the city then turned back around and said, nope, you only get the water that you need for coffee makers, toilets, whatever. So it went from, first of all, you have to bring water for coffee, toilets, whatever, for the people that work there, to you only get it. And that's what we're seeing in the water. There's very valid concerns. I will not mitigate that at all. Very valid concerns. It's now for the industry and engineers, mechanical, electrical, civils, right, to help us engineer water out of the data center again. And that's where we have to go in reality.
Perfect. One of the things, the other thing that I get asked an awful lot, and we've had the opportunity to sit down as an organization with some of the folks building these data centers, the larger companies, your Googles and your Metas and some of that. They, I know we know how fast technology is changing all the time, and when they have talked to us, and I won't say which company talked about this, but they talk about the size of the hyperscale ones, the really large ones, and they talk
Yep.
about they want these to be a 60-year facility is the idea of what they build it to. I know, as we all know, um, technology in and of itself has also gotten us on to take things large, we make it smaller. How can the industry kind of prepare when you're talking about a lifespan of some of these facilities for 60 years or so? And a lot of
Yep.
questions on we're building this now, we're building these larger scale facilities now, and obviously we're going to need the processing capacity, the storage capacity, but the industry also has learned to shrink things. How do those two things kind of work together?
Yep, yep. I just was out at the ranch last week, and I kind of chuckle always because if familiar with Western Nebraska and Western South Dakota, back when I was a kid, to have any kind of corn growth in that area was unheard of, right? And this time I went to the ranch, and last fall there was an 8-row corn picker going by the place. I'm like, where in the world is that thing going? Because it's lost completely.
Right, right.
And the crops look pretty good. So I go into, it becomes an engineering kind of problem. But what we're seeing specifically to your question, what you see in these data center spaces, and why I brought this back up to answer that question is, let's say this room here is a 20,000 square foot room, and let's say it was built in like 2015 would have been the room, and it was designed at 10 megawatts of power, and that would have been a lot of power in that day, right? And but 10 years ago. And so what you see is the density of these racks going back to that 5 megawatts to the 30 megawatts to the 100 megawatts. And it's not uncommon to see 60, 70 megawatt type racks today. What happens is I wind up losing the ability to have multiple rows, and I can only have a handful of rows. So you wind up with a lot of empty white space. It's the white space where typically the IT equipment is called. It's called the white space versus the gray space where a facility is, because I'm limited by the amount of power. So this rack that once drew 5 megawatts, or this 5 kW, and this row maybe pulled 100 kW, well, now itself might pull 1 megawatt of power in that whole row. So you wind up with a shell, and I've been in data centers in Kansas and other places, and the large facilities where it's a 60,000 square foot building, but only 10,000 square feet of it is usable. And therefore, you have 50,000 square feet of one data hall that's just wide open, call it whatever you want to be. Now, what we can do with that's a great question, but that's where you see, as a building starts to decline and its ability to serve, that space, open space, starts to come up and the racks start to be fewer. And that's why I throw that three-part equation out there. One is a campus, a building, and a KW, or megawatt per cabinet design. Those are the three factors of saying, okay, what can this building actually serve and to whom?
I want to go back to that slide that talked about some of the the risk side of things too, as kind of our final question. I know
Sure.
um, that we, again, as we talk about these things, if you
Mm-hmm.
could, as again, as we have counties that are talking about moratoriums, 12-month moratoriums, where they build a data center there so they can get their zoning regulations kind of figured out a little bit. As our members put policy together here this fall, what are kind of some things to keep in mind when it comes to, we see both sides, right? We see talks of what data centers could do in terms of building a tax base, and we can talk about what it means for construction jobs locally in the area and some of those things. But you have the risks there too. What are some, not just the risk side, but you had that slide there, so I brought it up. But what are some maybe things is for folks to keep in mind as we think of policies in this space? What are some things that we need to kind of keep front and center as we talk about these?
The first one is, that I bring up, there's these obvious ones, but is transparency, right? And that transparency starts with, hey, if you're of X size of a data center coming in, what can the utility provide to us today? No problem, right? And so do you, data center, if you're knocking on my door, I want you to pay for a study to tell me the impacts all the way up to the providers of that utility at that substation, right? So against that transparency. Also, how can we tax them? That's a big one that is really kind of coming to light, is how do we tax these data centers? Because the industry knows the incentives of the years gone back are starting to dry up. There's no more free sales tax and no whatever. Those are drying up. So how do we tax them? But how do we properly tax a data center as a data center facility, right? We know how to tax an ag as a ranch or a CAFO or a co-op at a local place. We know how to tax those, but we don't know how to tax data centers as a data center. So if you look at this building, going back to this building, to build this building out, what you're going to have on the perimeter outside, to build a building, you're anywhere between 10 and 12 million per megawatt. So if I'm going to build a $10 million or 10 megawatt facility, it's going to be $100 million. If I'm going to build a 100 megawatt facility, right, I'm going to a billion. That's to build the building. The IT equipment to go in there, if it's AI or non-AI, varies, but that's going to be anywhere from 2 to 3x the cost of that construction. So how do we tax them to be fair, but yet not be giving? And so that's something that we need to be transparent around all the way up. And there's a lot of policies that need to be changed, or laws that need to be changed, so that your county assessors know how to do it. Because all the ones I've talked to today are like, well, it's a commercial warehouse, so we're just going to do it as a warehouse. Well, that's not right, because it costs way more than a warehouse. So that is some policy that, in assistance of those local counties, we need to help them assess it properly, so we get our revenue out of it, right? Because there are counties that have really come back and said, hey, we went from 750,000 a year to 3.5 million in the first 7 months of the year. That in terms of tax revenue, having a facility. But again, transparency is everything, in my opinion. Transparency.
Perfect.
So once you build that, I want to know, what is the sound? So does the data center require to have perimeter sound continuously metering that's available to the community, so we can always see where it's at? Water usage, power usage. You see that in some states that are moving towards, hey, you must report your power. If you're a data center provider, you must provide your power consumption on a monthly basis to, call it the PUC or whoever. Again, transparency that didn't exist but needs to exist today.
Excellent. Well,
Yeah.
Scott, we are right at an hour, so I just want to thank you so much for joining us, and really appreciate the time and the information, because as I've said a couple times, we're right at the beginning, or for a lot of counties, their policy development time, and we love to provide opportunities for members to hear. We'll have opportunities for members to submit ideas and all of that of where we need to be as an organization. But at first, before we can create sound policy, we want to make sure we provide as much information to members as we can. And so having webinars like this is a part of that, and your expertise in here is what we want to try to provide. So thank you so much, Scott. Thank you, everyone, for
I'm going
joining
to
us
cause a
tonight.
little time
Oh,
out
go
there
ahead,
real quick,
Scott.
because I don't like to say I'm an expert. I've just got a lot of experience, but these things are changing so fast that probably 10 people on this call could correct me or change me or give me more information. And that's why we're all in it together. That's genuinely why we're in it together, because we're creating some of this as a society. We also have some big players that are making things happen. But this whole data center thing as it's evolving and everything, we're in it together. So share knowledge. I'm happy to learn just as much as I'm happy to share. So thank you,
Excellent.
Jordan. Appreciate it.
Excellent.
And
Thank
thank
you
you,
so
everyone.
much, Scott. We really appreciate it. Thank you, everyone. Again, we did record the webinar tonight. We will send that out to folks so you can again have the information right in front of you. As always, please feel free to reach out to any member of the Nebraska Farm Bureau Public Policy team if you have questions on this. This is hopefully going to be the first of several data center webinars we're going to do, or other public policy webinars we'll do. So just keep looking to your emails and our publications, and we'll get the information out to you. So thanks again, Scott. Thank you, everyone else. Have a good
Thank
night.
you. Have a great night, everyone. Cheers. Thank you.